Guys, let's get started. Good morning to you. Good morning. There we go. Glad to have everybody here this morning. I went back and listened to David's lesson last week. How many of you were here last week, by the way? Oh, okay, pretty good crew over there. All right. David said I would answer all your questions, so I noticed he said that. And I'll be glad to do that because I can say I don't know just like everybody else. But we can study together and learn together. I have a sign right when you walk in to my office to remind me. I actually bought this little piece in a church in Trafalgar Square in London, England. And it's a quote from Michelangelo, and it says, "I am still learning." So I hung that there to remind myself that I'm still learning, and and so as I learn and as I grow and study, I found things that I thought at one time in my life were just as true and solid as could be. Come to find out, I get to digging in the Bible, and you know what? That's not exactly what it said. And I don't know if you've had that experience or not. And so I've thought, well, you know what? I need to restudy some stuff. And so I've done that with different things over the course of my life. And I'm still learning. Sometimes you ask yourself, did I miss something? You know? And so as we talk about the image of God, and we talk about, in this particular thing we're going to talk about today is same-sex marriage okay under God's covenant? Can you have a covenant relationship with someone of the same sex and that be a biblically okay situation? That is what many churches now have come to believe. And so I went to a particular gathering a year or so ago on folks that were, some of them people I've known for years, and others I had never known. Some from major universities that study the Bible and think that the Bible allows this. And so I asked myself, did I miss something? That's not where I'm at. So did I miss this, or have we missed this? Do I have this wrong? We started 2 weeks ago in this lesson talking about when Jesus came in John chapter 1, that he came full of grace and truth. And we always have to have both of those going along in our life. So loving God and loving people are the greatest command, right? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, your neighbor as yourself. So regardless of what we study, we cannot violate the greatest commands in how we approach people. So whether I agree or disagree with same-sex marriage, how I treat people in that community, in the homosexual community, I cannot violate the greatest commandment and how I treat people. Does that make sense? I want to make sure that's clear. Because I listen to a lot of things, and I have heard churches and I've heard preachers get up and make the rudest, harshest statements that do more harm than good. They don't teach anybody. They're just preaching to the choir. And make jokes about people who have a real struggle in their life. And the last thing we need to do as God's people is to violate that principle of loving folks and being compassionate. God was a compassionate God, is a compassionate God, always has been. God's also a holy God, and he challenges us in holiness also. And so I just want to make sure that groundwork is laid, that there is no excuse to do harm to people we disagree with in terms of how they live their life. Now, I don't expect non-Christians to live like Christians, okay? So that's kind of a different ball of wax to me, because people who do not claim to be Christians or who do not claim the Bible as trying to uphold their lifestyle, and they just live in immorality, whether it's homosexuality or fornication or whatever it is, they just live that way. That's not what I'm talking. I mean, look, everybody makes their own choice. I don't expect people in the world to live like Jesus. Okay? But there are people now within religion who claim to live like Jesus, and some do live like Jesus in a lot of ways. This is what makes it difficult. And yet, think the Bible teaches that a covenant relationship between two people of the same biological sex is an okay thing with God. So that's kind of what we're dealing with, all right? Okay. So we started with the very fact, and we have to do this, to go back, and David did a good job. Hopefully I helped some the week before, about the image of God. This is not just, am I violating a verse somewhere? It's not that simple. It's not that. It's not, is there a command that says, don't be like this, and that violates it, and so that's wrong. It's not like that. Okay? It's tied a whole lot more to the image we are. We are created in the image of God. And the image of God is tied directly to being male and female in Genesis chapter 1. God says, let us make man in our image. And he created them male and he created them female. David talked a little bit about that. And so that image is very, very important. Because in Hebrews chapter 1, Jesus is the exact representation of God. He is the image of God. He is God, right? We are, as Christians, when we become a Christian, we become to conform our lives to the image of Christ. We are to look more and more like Him inside and out with our character and our lifestyle and our heart. Okay? We're conforming to His image. That's what Paul taught in Romans. In Romans chapter 12 and Romans chapter 8, we conform to the image of Christ. It's already been predetermined that those that are in Christ will conform to the image of Christ. Romans 8. So, why is this so important when it deals with our sexuality? Because it's tied to being male and female, both in the image of Christ. Marriage is defined in Genesis as male and female, and they're seen as portraying the image of Christ. So, anytime I tarnish the image of God in my life, or the image of Christ in my life, I'm headed in the wrong direction. Does that make sense? Okay, for example, when I become a Christian and I'm baptized into Christ, baptism is not simply a commandment I keep because He says, go baptize folks. It's not that. Baptism is a reenacting of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the gospel. So when I do that, I'm saying, as Paul said it in Galatians and in Colossians, I'm clothing myself with Christ. I'm putting Christ on. And from that point on, it's a new birth. Then I start trying to look like and conform myself to the image of Christ from then on out. So even in my conversion, there's the image of Christ involved. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So, in sexual immorality, we tarnish the image of Christ. You see, in Leviticus, where we get some of the harder statements about homosexuality, where he says a man shall not sleep with another man like he does a woman, and vice versa, and all this, and a list of other things, by the way. That's not the only thing. Sexual immorality, adultery, all this kind of stuff. It says all this is an abomination. Why? Because it's the degrading of yourself. Instead of forming the image of God, you're running from the image of God. You're damaging the image of God that's in your life. So, when people say the Bible doesn't say anything, for example, I get this argument all the time. Well, Jesus doesn't say anything about homosexuality. Well, he doesn't use that term. Now, here's the problem with terminology nowadays. You have to decide when you're reading someone's material or when they're talking to you what they mean by the terms they use. It's going to be very important. If someone says, I am gay, that does not necessarily mean they are immoral. Someone says, I'm homosexual, it does not mean they are immoral. Let me tell you why. Because they use that term as a noun to describe their same-sex attraction. That does not mean they are actively involved in same-sexuality activity. Got it? You understand what I'm saying? So that's why we have to be careful that someone can say, I am gay. That does not mean they are living wrong or being sexually immoral, because they have that attraction. I'm heterosexual and I have temptations and I have attraction. That does not mean I'm immoral. I'm not making a move on that. That's not the activity of my life. So we need to understand especially in reading people's material, what they mean by. When they use the word affirm, like, so you have churches now that they title themselves affirming churches. They affirm that marriage, same-sex marriage, is okay with God. They're affirming that. That's what that community wants us to do, is to affirm it. I welcome anybody to this assembly. Doesn't matter. Someone said, Mike, what are you going to do when someone walks in? And, well, it's already happened. What do you mean, what are you going to do? We have that all the time. You may not know it, but that happens all the time. What do? You put your hand out. You welcome people. You love folks. That does not mean I affirm a position that they might hold theologically. But we welcome and love everybody, right? Yeah. Sure we do. We better. That's what we need to do. God loved us when we were all messed up. Yeah. How arrogant it would be to think that someone that I still don't mess up, the other is that somehow or another I've got it all together and I don't have to turn around and love you in your mess ups. Spare me from that church, because I'm never going to live up to their expectations, right? So it's very, very important how we treat people and understand what they mean by their terminology. Now, I do want to make you aware of some resources that I think has really helped me. There's a book by Rubel Shelley called The Ink is Dry. And it's God's distinctive word on marriage, family, and sexual responsibility. Excellent book. He's such a great history guy, because some of the arguments that the homosexual community, religious community makes, he defeats in terms of what they say about history and what they say about terminology in the Bible. Excellent. There's another book by a guy named Preston Sprinkle called Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? That has been a very useful thing too. Now, I'm not saying I agree with everything in somebody's book or everything else they say, okay? I'm just telling you some resources that have been useful to me. There's another book called Holy Sexuality and the Gospel by Christopher Ewan. He came here a couple of years ago and spoke. Excellent, top-notch stuff, really good. It really helped you think through some stuff. Thought that was really excellent. Rubel has a much thicker, more academic one of this that expands a ton of history and footnotes for guys that if you want something in your library that you can really dig into, because some of the arguments that are made, like, well, they didn't have this They didn't have this in Bible times. They didn't have same-sex marriage, people making a covenant relationship following the Bible. They didn't have that in Bible times. Oh, yeah, they did. And he goes through history and shows exactly what 14 of the first 15 Caesars in Rome were homosexual. So don't think for a minute they weren't legitimizing same-sex marriage in their society. Greek and Rome did it. They were much further down the road than where we are as a nation, by the way. Way further down the road. So that's why his title, The Ink is Dry. In other words, the Bible has already written on this. Okay? The ink is dry. So what happens is people, to make that argument, you have to either go back and redefine terms in the Bible, or you have to go back to a reinterpretation of context to try to make the argument. We'll deal with some of that a little bit later too. But I just want to make sure we understand, one, how to treat people who are different from us. The other is that that the image of God is very, very important in this study to give us the foundation and basis. Now, the other thing, think about this. When in Leviticus, it's probably your favorite book. You're probably reading that this morning, weren't you? Leviticus. I mean, how many of you sit around and say, I love Leviticus. I mean, only Mike Williams does that, by the way. I remember one time he was studying Leviticus. He called me late at night. I mean, it was late at night, and I'm like, what's Williams called? He said, Kelly, I mean, I can't tell you. I'm so excited. I've been reading Leviticus, and I'm like, what? That's not what you read to fall asleep? I mean, come on, But actually, it's a really great book. But here's why. It goes into so much detail. But there's a reason behind it. The first 16 chapters of Leviticus is about worship right. Being holy in worship. The rest of the book, in chapter 17 to the rest of the book, is about living right. Here's how you worship and all the things you do involved in that, very detailed about how to worship and honor God the right way. And the rest of it is about how to live right and holy. And in the middle of that is the statement that gets quoted again several times in the New Testament is, be holy because what? I am holy. Now, you can't read Leviticus and understand it without going back to Genesis. Remember in Genesis, divinity, heaven visits earth. Divinity, God creates human beings and puts his image in them when he does that. And you have the presence of God in the garden. Got it? Then that's ruined by sin and tarnished, and you have this all of a sudden downhill going, and sinfulness, and all kinds of things break out in humanity. Now he says, look, I've created you in the image of God. I want you to multiply and be fruitful. And that's true, and they did that, but they also, because of sin, they reproduced some sinful things in their lives too. Now, when you get to Leviticus, you have a big emphasis on the tabernacle. What's the tabernacle represent? And what? The presence of God. What do you have in the garden? The presence of God. So what do you have at the tabernacle and the tent meeting? The presence of God. What guarded the garden, by the way, when he kicked them out? Remember that? You can say it out loud if you want to. Those angels are cherubim, right? What's engraved at the tabernacle? The cherubim. So you have this presence of God in the garden. Then you have this trying to get them to understand his presence again in the tabernacle and the temple and the tent meeting. And then Jesus comes on the scene, and divinity touches humanity again, and God becomes flesh. And the Bible says in John 1, he tabernacled among us. He became flesh. He made his dwelling. That's the word for dwelling. Tabernacled among us. Now hang on with me. I'm getting to a point here, okay? And then when we become Christians and are baptized into Christ, we receive something. What do we receive? The Holy Spirit. And heaven touches humanity again. And you have the presence of God. All this to produce the image of God in us. And that only happens through male and female. That does not happen in any other creation or creature. Doesn't happen. And it pictures the relationship between us and God. Now, Jesus is called the bridegroom. Who's the bride? The church. So you have this picture again at the very end. And in Ephesians, when he talks about marriage, and he says, I'm not just saying this about marriage, this is because this is the church. Christ is the head of the church. We're the bride of Christ. By the way, this is why we don't talk bad about each other. You talk bad about my bride, I'm going to get mad. We don't talk bad about the bride of Christ. God doesn't like that. That one's free. That didn't cost you anything. Okay? But there's that image. It's a complementary, it's a male-female image that started in the garden. Then the presence of God continues in the tabernacle with the priesthood and then how to live holy through that book. And then it continues in the coming of Christ and the gospel's preached because the gospel is revealing God's righteousness. And then it's going to end with that same type of picture. Does that make sense? All right. Okay. Romans chapter 1. Let's dig into a verse or two. Let's see here. Okay. Romans chapter 1. We typically go to Romans 1 and we get the gospel out of Romans 1, 16 and 17. That's where we're going to start. I'm not ashamed of the power of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God's salvation. Everyone who believes, first the Jew and the Gentile. Here it is. For in the gospel, a righteousness of God is revealed. A curtain is pulled back, and we see how God was right in what he was doing through the gospel. That's what that means, okay? A righteousness from God is revealed, and the righteous will live by faith. Now he's going to get this next section in Romans where everybody is condemned, and everybody has the same need of Jesus. The Jew, the pagan, the moral man, they all have the same need. It says the wrath of God is being revealed, not that it will be, is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness, wickedness, and men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, there's the garden again, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and we call this section, I call it the Great Exchange. Look here. Exchange the glory of the immortal God for images. There's that word, image, created in God's image. It literally means to cut out. And that's why God says from the beginning, don't cut out things and don't have no graven images. Don't do that. All right? No, that's why idolatry is such a sinful situation. Made to look like mortal man and birds and animals. Therefore God gave them over to sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged, here's another exchange, the truth of God for a lie, and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who's forever praised. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even the women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Well, let's talk about this. Because when you first just read that, you're thinking, how could anybody miss this? That's kind of what I first thought when I read it. How could anybody think that somehow or another homosexuality is okay when you read these verses, right? Now remember, he's describing a community of people and culturally what happened to them, and morally and immorally what happened to them as they refused to retain God in their mind. All right. So this is a general description of what happens when a society or a group of folks exchange the truth of God for a lie, worship created things, typically themselves, more than they do God. They suppress truth, refuse to believe it anymore, and it leads them away from the image of God. That's what happens. Okay. What he's not describing here is every individual's intent or motive that do these sinful acts. Because when he lists all these, he lists more than the homosexual stuff, but because he's going to list a whole lot more: envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanders, God-haters. He's going to list all those down further in the text. I've known people who have gossiped that they weren't denying the truth of God. So what does he mean? He's describing the symptoms of a culture that refuses to retain God in his knowledge. He's not describing every individual that ever commits one of these sins, because I've committed some of these sins.
Can you say that sentence again, please?
He's describing, I don't know if I can say it again or not, but go listen to the tape. He's describing the symptoms of a community that refuse to retain God in their knowledge. This is where it leads people to. He's not necessarily describing every individual that commits or struggles with one of these sins, that they all of a sudden, that they have refused to retain God. Because we all battle some of these sins, right? And yet I believe in God. So in other words, here's why I want to make this point very clear. There are very good-hearted people who follow Jesus in a ton of good ways, who are gay. Not every gay person does not deny God. I've got friends that are gay, that are homosexual. And they're battling in their own heart and mind about they believe in God, they believe in the Bible, and they've tried to follow God, and they've battled this thing, and finally, after years and years and years, some have get away from it. Others just finally give into it and say, no, God just made me this way. Now, they're not what he's necessarily describing as a whole community here. This does describe what happened in Rome, right? Remember what Paul's writing to the church in Rome. In a culture that this has happened. So this is what happens. This is what happens, and I think this is what's happening in American culture. Because first there's the sympathy, sympathize, then there's normalize, right? If we can make this look normal, we can get away from God on following things. So that's why, look at all the commercials. How many now, a few years ago, you didn't see homosexual couples in commercials, and now you see it all the time. Why is that? To appeal to that community and to normalize it. Now, this verse says that when they practice these things, they are doing something. They're going against nature. So this is an interesting argument here. He says, look at verse 26. Even their women exchange natural relations for unnatural ones. So how would you, if you were in the gay community and you were a gay Christian, you followed Christ, and you were how could you explain this verse where it didn't condemn what you were doing? Well, a couple different ways. One, this context isn't talking about me. This context is talking about people who just practice a bunch of immorality out there who don't care about God. I'm in a covenant relationship with God, and me and my mate are, and so we're in a different context. That's one revisionist approach to try to make it okay. All right. The other is, well, what do you do about this going against nature? Okay. If you believe you're born this way, then you say that is my what? That is my nature. So these people are talking about heterosexual people who do homosexual activity. That's what goes against their nature. Does that make sense? I don't think it's right. I'm just trying to get you to understand the logic sometimes where people get to. Got it? I don't want to make an argument so strong you believe a lie. I just want you to understand people in this are trying very hard, a lot of people are trying very hard to figure out biblically how they can stay within what they think is inside their mind and heart about their own sexual attraction and practice it and still be a believing person. So this is where you get into redefining definitions of things and re-looking at context to try to do away with the prohibition. Because if I can say, well, that context really doesn't fit me, then it really doesn't apply to me. Got it? Does that make sense? Like this if it does, like this if it doesn't, or like that if you just don't. Okay. All right. Okay, so the arguments that are made aren't necessarily made from bad-hearted people. Matter of fact, a lot of times it's just the opposite. I know a couple, I noticed on Facebook that they were celebrating the marriage of their daughter to another woman. And they're all Christians, claim to be Christians. They've been followers of Christ for years. Years. He's been an elder in a couple different churches in his lifetime. So I see this, and in my mind I'm like, okay, how did you get there? You made a move. How did you make that move? Now, cultural challenges of morality, of what is right or wrong, always challenges us to restudy something. That's not a bad thing. How many of us had positions on marriage and divorce that were I held some pretty silly positions on marriage and divorce until I really got into the Bible and studied it. But I probably would have never studied it if divorce hadn't become so prevalent in our culture. So that happens to people in their personal life. So they don't really study it until all of a sudden it happens to them. Now, we typically say, well, he wouldn't believe that, but now, he wouldn't really do that, but now his daughter's gay, and now that's why he believes it. Well, maybe it made him rethink and restudy it. I know it made him restudy it. And so now, is that a legitimate study? Well, yeah, it can be. It might not be. I don't know. We'll judge the man's heart. But if you think you found a way that your child who battled something so desperately in their heart for so long can be right with God, and you can keep right with them, it's going to be real easy to go that direction. Because you love them, right? I mean, even Peter said, and James said, love covers a. Ask any enabler. Ask any parent in here. Some of y'all did this, right? Yeah. You enabled your kids. And that wasn't good, but your love covered a multitude of sins. That principle got applied. Well, that happens when people restudy something because all of a sudden it's a part of their life. So be careful not to judge people's motives or even their conclusions. I mean, it might be very obvious. Yeah, you didn't study this until it happened to you. But guess what? It's going to happen to all of us. I have some gay people in my family. I don't love them less. I want to share with them Jesus because they're not the ones that are claiming to be right spiritually, because they're not claiming that. I promise you, that's not their situation. But also, I mean, I've got a good friend, doesn't live here, grew up here, and he says, you know what? I've tried all the conversion stuff. I've tried all the getting out of this. I've just settled. This is where I am. God made me this way. Okay, so that's your attraction. So what are you going to do with that? Because see, he's married to a woman that has a child, and so my challenge then is, well, did you make a covenant with God? You better keep your covenant. See, here's the problem. In our culture, everything is about making us happy. We think we have a right to pleasure. If I'm not mistaken, this idea of I just need to find myself, get in touch with myself, all those kinds of things. I saw a statement the other day, be authentic to yourself, those kinds of things. The Bible says if you're going to be a disciple, you have to what? Deny yourself. Take up the cross and follow Jesus. Forget about condemning what a person's struggle is. Go ahead and go right to the heart of the matter. What's a disciple look like who's representing the image of Christ? You can't make a move to please yourself and somehow or another say, I have a right to do that because God made me this way. God made me heterosexual, but I don't have a right to other women outside my marriage. I don't have that right. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if my wife, when I was 21 years old, if she'd been in a car wreck and we could never have sex again, it wouldn't matter. I still do not have a right to go out and please myself and tarnish the image of God. I have a responsibility to follow the Word of God in how I treat her and how I treat other people. So this idea of redefining things so that I can have pleasure or please myself, put myself in that position, is not a priority of the Bible. The priority is, how can I be an image bearer of God, and what does that require of me, regardless of my attractions or my temptations? Are we close to being done? We're getting close, aren't we? All right. I didn't get nowhere near where I wanted to get. Couple of statements. We're to reproduce the image of Christ, regardless of what we claim as orientation. The world always says the opposite of what God does and tries to get you to buy the lie. Here's the lie. Gender is flexible. Orientation is not. In other words, if I'm attracted, if my sexual orientation is toward a man, I can't change that. God made me what? That's the claim. God made me that way. All right. That's not changeable. But my gender is. That's the world's. The Bible says just the opposite. Gender is not what's changeable. You're born, created, man or woman. There's not but two. There's not but two. That's unchangeable. Biologically, I'm a certain way. Now, here's where we get. You think how crazy this is. When man gets to the point that he thinks for his own pleasure, he can change how you were created, physically make changes. And this is what people want to do to our kids in schools. They want to take an 11-year-old who says, an 11-year-old girl who says, I think I'm a boy, and all of a sudden we're going to do some kind of hormone therapy and surgery and all, and without even parents knowing about it? Are you kidding me? This is where Satan's lie takes us, to these kind of places. This is why it's so important as a church. We got to respond to those people. No, I'll tell you what that 11-year-old girl needs. She needs the love of God and the love of God's people. And regardless of what you struggle with, here is where you can find hope. And here's where you can find rescue. Here's where you can find love and acceptance, regardless of what you struggle with. The church has the answer for a lot of this. But so many times we don't know how to engage that particular community of people. And we need to learn that in a much better way. All right, that's enough for you today. I love you guys. Thanks for being here, by the way, and thanks for your patience.